Hello, my name is Laura Berry, and I'm the Executive Director of the Interfaith Center of Corporate Responsibility. It's a nearly 40-year coalition of institutional investors who have always viewed their investments through the lens of their faith traditions. We have about 300 members, and we represent over $100 billion in invested capital. I'm here today to just do three things very, very quickly. The first is to really offer my appreciation and gratitude to both the Willow Creek community and my good friend Gary Moore for giving ICCR an opportunity to talk a little bit about our work as institutional faith-based investors and how we really approach the notion of corporate responsibility. Second, to talk just a little bit about what it is our organization does, what some of the ways that we are working with institutional investors around the world to really start to address some of the concerns that we've seen so powerfully exhibited in the capital markets recently. And then lastly is to offer an invitation to all people of faith to start to think a little bit differently about how we value our investments and how the choices we make makes a huge difference in not only investment returns, but in the returns for all of us as people of God. So first, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. ICCR was first brought together by a group of 12 Protestant denominations back in 1971. We began our work at that time by inventing a tool for the first time as institutional investors. We started to think about where we were earning our returns, the returns that were so important to our endowments, because our endowments typically fund the ability of the folks who work in our communities to retire with dignity, or they fund the important mission work that we do all over the globe. We started to think about whether it was appropriate and, in fact, as people of faith contributed to justice and sustainability, if we were invested in places where the kinds of things that our faith traditions led us to consider were being ignored or not being paid attention to in the way we might like. So the tool that we invented was the idea as owners, as shareholders, as folks who own common stock, to begin to talk with companies about some of the practices that we thought didn't contribute to our fiduciary responsibility as long-term investors, but also did not contribute to the kinds of things that our faith traditions taught us: loving our Creator, loving creation, and most importantly, exhibiting through our portfolios a love of each other. So the tool that we invented was the idea of filing advice or advisory resolutions on the proxy statements of publicly held companies. As you can well imagine, that tool was looked at with quite a bit of skepticism in the early years in the 70s, but the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, decided that institutional investors did in fact have the right to provide suggestions to the corporations they owned as owners, and that as universal investors, or investors who really invested in the entire economy, we had an obligation to bring these concerns to the corporations that we owned. We began with apartheid in South Africa, talking with GM about their business practices there, in the hope that they would begin to change practices and that in fact that would lead to the fall of this repressive regime someday. In 1994, Bishop Desmond Tutu said that it was actually the action of faith-based investors that led to a less violent and a speedier fall of apartheid. From the creation of that tool, we fast forward to ICCR's impact today. Today, ICCR files approximately 350 proxy resolutions every year with global companies. These resolutions deal with a number of different issues, but some of the big areas in today's market are issues like corporate governance, which include things like dilution of shares, include things like excessive CEO compensation, include things like important governance practices like separation of board chair and CEOs. They also include things like global health, access to health care in our country. They include things like the important concerns about climate change. They include things like human trafficking and other practices that, as investors of faith, we must convince the corporations that we own to take a very serious look at. So that we file a number of resolutions. Our members participate in over 650 dialogues every year. And we are often, as one person said recently to me, we are often the crystal ball through which folks start to wonder, what will people be talking about in the Wall Street Journal 5 years from now? We like to think that one of the best examples of the prophetic voice of faith in this discipline as institutional investors is our original filing in 1993 with 6 financial services companies, alerting them, in a way, an early warning system of the dangers of subprime lending. We have all seen what's happened as a result of that. And in fact, over that time period since 1993, we filed over 400 corporate resolutions trying to convince financial service companies here in the United States to reconsider securitization, improper underwriting standards, and other egregious practices that have led to the collapse of the global capital markets. We are also working very hard on valuation models. We are thinking about what and how we measure, how do we move beyond things like price-earnings ratios and other metrics. We are working with many, many analytical colleagues in academic institutions across the country to start to consider how can we look differently at off-balance sheet risk, and are participating with a great and strong voice, a collective voice of people of faith, talking with the SEC and their 21st Century Disclosure Initiative, and working with FASB to start to create new accounting rules so that we can really think differently about accountability. We began by inventing tools. We are still very much in the business of inventing tools so that there will no longer be something like socially responsible investing, biblically responsible investing. There will just be really the kind of investing where everything of value is considered in our investment portfolios as institutional long-term investors. So the last thing that I wanted to share was an invitation to everyone who has had an opportunity to listen to the breadth and the depth of ideas and some very provocative notions that Gary Moore has shared with you on this DVD, and to invite you to take a look at our website, www.iccr.org, and think about whether some of the practices, either as an individual investor, as a holder of mutual funds, or as a participant in the stewardship of larger institutional funds, whether some of the work that we're doing, some of the information that we provide might be useful and interesting to you as we all work very hard to live out our faith, to show how we love God, to show how we love God's creation, and to, most importantly, demonstrate how much we love each other. Thank you.